Kia ora, let's try that again. Thank you. Anybody like to guess what tree that is? Anyone who's not Scott?
A fig tree.
How did you know that?
Because I've got one myself.
Have you? In a pot?
No, in the good.
How big is it?
Reasonably big.
How big is reasonably big?
Probably 2.5 meters by 1.5.
Yep, this is a fig tree. When we bought our house, it was in our garden and in a pot. And every year, in winter, it just sits there looking like it's dead. And then sometime in summer, it gets big leafy leaves, and it is yet to produce a fig. The previous owner of the house told me it would, but I'm probably not feeding it enough stuff. Fig trees grow slowly, but they grow really big. This is a fig tree. This is a bigger fig tree. This is a fig tree. They've had to put a fence around it. That's why it's in a pot. There's no room in our garden to repot and grow the fig. And in fact, apparently Nelson, did you know this? Nelson and Picton have a fig tree problem. Because they do grow in New Zealand, and birds come and eat bits of the figs, and then they go and they do what birds do elsewhere, and then there's another fig tree. And apparently both Picton and Nelson have problems with an infestation of fig trees. Who would have known? In the fig trees are quite popular in the Bible. They grow slowly, but they grow quite big, and they become the modern-day version of a muesli bar tree. Yes, it keeps you regular, but secondly, its fruit is something that you can pack up and take anywhere because it dries, and so it's instantly transportable. And so they're really a desirable thing. If you had a family home and a big garden, you want to have a fig tree in the Middle East. Really desirable. And you'll remember there's a story in the Bible where Jesus goes to a fig tree because he's hungry, and he famously curses it because there were no figs. And it's like, hang on, you're here to provide figs. This is what you're about. Admittedly, the one in my pot, if anyone would like a fig tree, we have one going spare. I've been feeling bad about how constricted it is, but I would also feel conflicted about planting it because of the way it spreads. So I don't know how old the fig tree is. How do you know how old a tree is? Mata, mata, mata. Oh, there's the fruit. Well, there's Tane Mahuta, and we don't know how old Tane Mahuta is. We'll only know if we cut it off and you can see the rings. They think between 1,250 years and 2,500 years, which is big, eh? We're about to celebrate our 100th. That's not a lot in tree years. Trees matter in the Bible. There's a tree of life at the beginning of the Bible and at the end. And yes, there's another tree. And then there's Moses encounters God in a burning, well, I'm going to call it a tree because it can be translated either way. Jesus is said to be hung on a tree. But I'd like to think about trees because they make us think about age. And now, part of this, you'll see I'm wearing a shirt that says Arotahi. The New Zealand Baptist Missionary Society has a new brand. They're calling themselves Arotahi. They're doing it because if you're applying to go into an overseas country and you have the word Baptist in the title, people go, oh, yep. And so some of you know, probably 20 years ago, they relabeled themselves as Transcend, which was quite good because there was a company then called Transpower, and railways had something like that. I've forgotten them. It doesn't work so well today because when you use any word that has trans in it, everybody under 30 thinks, you're talking LGBT. And so they figure they need to rename it. They've renamed it as Transcend and, as Arotahi. And you can see in the little logo here, it looks like the rings of a tree. It's got 3 or 4 different looks, but when they were introducing it, they put up the rings of a tree and they kind of tracked events through it. And I thought, what a fantastic way of telling a story, to track through events. So what I'd like to do today is have a little bit of a look at God's really big story, and then zoom in a little bit and have a little bit of a look at Parkland's story, and then invite you to look at your own. Okay, and I think there's value in this. So we'll start off with, I think it's the UK Bible Society has produced a short clip well, it's about 3.5 minutes long, that tells the whole story of the Bible. And when do you ever get that? So I'd like us to hear the story of the Bible.
Right at the start, the original orator set out solar systems with stanzas, and from the dust he formed us as the ultimate reflection of his perfection, until the cataclysmic mistake, with the snake spoiling the truth and speaking the fake news, knowledge misused and trust abused, sin goes viral. Yet a seed sown, pointing to a promise of a rescuer homegrown, they wait. Time passes, Abe gets the call up, then Isaac to Jacob, God wrestler. The providence of God sees Joe go from prisoner to prime minister. 400 years pass, then a 10-plague standoff. Israel's shackles come free. Moses leads the way as God center parts the sea to Sinai. A 10-part moral compass, 12 eye spies, 40 years in the wilderness, they wait. Moses to Joshua, the baton gets passed, promised land with milk and honey on tap. Judges lead, then it all falls apart. People want a king, on paper Saul's mustard, but he wrecks the gig. Psalm singer David gets crowned and convicted. Temple gets built, but Solomon's conflicted. Kingdom divides, God's people get evicted. Daniel naps in a lion's den. 70 years pass, God brings them back then. Temple ruins get erected. A wall gets built, Jerusalem's protected, and they wait. 400 years pass. Enter magnificent maker of everything. Wrapped in linen cloths are beauty spots. Riffs off Isaiah, broke bread with outcasts. Healed abseiling paralytics who picked up their own mats. Passover palm leaves, then Passover to Gethsemane, to handcuffs, to trial, as Peter denies, on my mother's life I've not even met the guy. Then crucified. Love laid out his arms with one final cry, it is finished. But on the third day, hope reinstated with victory on display as the Messiah's stone rolled away. And before Jesus ascended, he says, wait. The Spirit's opening ceremony display. Tongues of fire, the works of a people full of praise. Stephen martyred, church close to despair, till Paul U-turns preaching the gospel everywhere. Church as community, radical diversity, and this is our part in the unfolding story. Now Spirit sealed, and for God's glory we participate, yet we still wait. And off the Isle of Patmos, Apostle John got a snapshot of how it all ends, and it's gonna be worth the wait. Sin's death grip will cease. No more tears, with fears forgotten and baggage sent packing, as the community of grace-gifted misfits welcome in the homecoming. From despair there'll be perfect repair, and hope will be there as the highlight for all time. He's the promise became pillar to the plotline. The living vine, original orator, solar system setter outer, the dust former and people potter. Word became flesh, put to death yet raised, so one day we may raise in him. So we raise our lives as an offering of praise for the one who's worth the wait.
Quite something, isn't it? If we step back from the story of God, the story that we're part of, at the beginning there is meaning and purpose in creation. There is a loving God, a caring God, and there's work to do in caring for the garden, and a promise that we can eat of any tree but not that one. And then it goes wrong. We eat of the only tree that will damage us, and we in creation get damaged. And then there's Abraham and Moses. And as we're going through this story, you could ask, what are we learning? How are we being changed? So the question, somehow or another, God chooses Abraham and then Moses and then rescues the people of Israel from a slavery that God had allowed to happen. Because without that, they might not ever known what it was to be free. You have to know its opposite. To have character. These are lessons that come from a hard place, but they're gold. And then the people of Israel, well, they have judges and they have a king and another, and then the lessons come hard. They are invaded by the Assyrians and Babylonians and trucked off to other places, living in the wrong place. They're cast out of the promised land. There's a funny kind of way here where the Garden of Eden story is being reenacted. They haven't got it right and they're cast out. And they learn to lament. They learn to not be in power, to rely on God when they can't rely on anyone else. They learn to long for peace. This is the time that most of our Old Testament books are written down. Before then, they were passed on by voice, but we think this is when they write it. And in an age of anxiety such as ours, we could be wise to listen to them, because they are not left high and dry, even though it feels that way. The prophets keep promising a future, and then the future arrives. A Messiah who came to love, not to judge, who joins in our place, works alongside us, is brutally killed, but whose life will not give up on us. And then the early church. And the Spirit of God that goes before them, confounding the critics, but also confounding the early Christians. What are you doing here, God? How come God's Spirit can be on them? They're not insiders. The church is a community that Paul starts to describe as the body of Christ. And this is clearly where we live. We are here, and then there's one more ring to come. We wait like the people of Israel in exile for the renewal, for home and hope. A place where things are sorted, the reconciliation of all things, the setting right, the gap between humans and God. The damage is no more. And each ring builds on the ring that came before. You kind of can't have this one without having a bit of that. It's a cumulative story, and this is the story we find ourselves part of. We are here. Okay, what about parklands? I'm not going to get this right, so if you're a long-time parklands person, please exercise some forgiveness. For the benefit of being interested, I may make some wrong statements. So to start off with, let's just acknowledge this area was swamp. And so for Maori, it was a food basket. There were lots of birds here. There were eels. It was a place, there was flax. It was a place where you could come and get stuff. And then the Pākehā arrive. First of all, hunting whales and flax for their boats. But then land is in their sights, and the first 4 ships come over to settle and plant a proper colony. Christchurch was going to be a proper English Anglican outpost. Which school did you go to? Now, I've jumped forward a good deal because actually I can't tell Parkland's story well. By the 1920s, people would come to North New Brighton, this area, for a holiday. Remember, this is early days for cars, and so the possibility of travelling long distances for a break wasn't really on people's radar, but people would come to the beach suburb, and actually it was interesting, when we did the combined service a couple of weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, a little while ago, there were people from Oxford Terrace who excitedly came up and said, I remember coming out and doing missions at North New Brighton Church. Because it was a camping place, a bit like the way many of us think of Spencer Park and Wood End now. A place you go to holiday. Well, they came here because it was not too hard. And that's right, other churches came out here. There were not lots of cars, but there were trams, and New Brighton is a holidays destination, and that's where North New Brighton Baptist Church starts. In the 1970s, and 80s, there's a charismatic renewal sweeping its way across New Zealand, and some people are going, yes, this is brilliant, and other people are going, I don't want none of that here. And Parklands was suddenly learning about the aliveness of the Spirit of God under the very capable guidance of Derek Wiltshire, someone who I've heard talk of. Who here knew Derek Wiltshire? A bunch of you. Am I doing him disfavours by saying this? And one of the things that always impressed me about him is that he was able to live without an income for the church. But he kept saying to the church, listen, you can't assume that's what will be what happens next. And I thought that was real wisdom. But very alive, the church was bursting at the seams, exploded in numbers, and moved into the Parklands area. It built, complete with employment assistance, a church down by the library. In fact, part of that library is the old church, is that correct? Its design is inherited from there. And then, of course, this mall became available, and the church moved in here and rekitted it. And I don't think we can tell Parkland's story without mentioning earthquakes. What did we learn in earthquakes? Well, I wasn't here, how dare I say. When I listen, I hear people talk about a second chapter of Acts experience, where people had things in common with their neighbours, where there was lots of serving, where we learnt to give to a community in need. I've had people really say, I wish we could be back there. And then more recently, we've had lockdowns, and we're heading to 100th. And at each stage of this life, there are questions you can ask about what is God teaching you, just as we can ask it about the people of God in God's bigger story. What is God working in us? Remember, we are the clay, not the potter. Much as I might like to say to that fig tree in my garden, you should be big like all the other fig trees, there is a bit of an issue there, isn't there? And that fig tree is not going to be able to solve it. At each stage of the tree, I think there's a question about what we're learning. And what are we learning? Well, what are we learning, dare I say? I guess personally, I think one thing we're discovering is that when you're seeking to help others, better not to use a soup kitchen model. All the people who have stuff on one side of the room, I have stuff. And all the people with no stuff on the other side of the room, I'm going to give you my stuff. Yep, which is a nice way of staying in charge. I got my stuff. I have control over what happens. But that doesn't build great relationship. So maybe a better model is to think of the way to help others is more like a potluck meal where everybody brings something. And it may be that I don't have a lot, so I don't bring a lot, but it doesn't matter. But I still get to contribute and get honoured in that animal. I think that's a little bit closer to Paul's view of church. I think for myself, part of what I have been learning lately is that maybe in the Western church, we've thought we've had a lot more answers than we do. And that one of the ways of learning is to pay attention to our margins and listen for answers. For me, that's part of the listen to their point of view, because I can't see outside my blinkers. But when I'm talking with someone who has different blinkers, then I have a chance. And for me, that's part of the importance of making connection with Māori, is I think they have riches to offer to us. But do not forget, the end of the story is hope and a home. No matter how dark it gets, how small the pot you find yourself stuck in, this is the end of the story. This is the end of the story, even with climate change, even with nuclear people rattling their sabres. The end of the story for those who love Christ is hope and home, at last being at home. But what about if you do it to yourself? Well, I was born in Australia and I moved to New Zealand at about age 7. That was tremendously shaping. This is my country. I know its smells, its sounds. They are part of me. I've been back to Australia, and I don't. It's not home to me. And I became a Christian. I would hope if you were drawing one of your own, and we have got graphs here so you could, Jesus becomes part of it for me as a young adult. And I come to Jesus out of, well, when I was a young adult, there was a lot of shame, a lot of inadequacy, a lot of angst. I think some of that goes with being a young adult, the uncertainty of life. I came to Jesus out of desperation, with lots of emotional pain, and I found the Jesus who forgives and who carries what I can't carry, and that was wonderful. Then I got a job, moved to Wellington, met Linda, did a lot of whitewater kayaking. I was trying to reflect, what were you doing on those times? One of the things I learnt was the fun of Jesus. I loved whitewater kayaking. There is nothing better. Well, there may be better things, but it was just spending a weekend paddling down these rivers. A lot of it's just sitting back waiting for the whitewater to come and then absolutely packing yourself as you go into these really big things of water and try and get the right way through. And it's just marvelous. Then Linda and I ended up in Hong Kong. And we got involved with drug addicts, and we saw the Jesus who heals and who transforms people. And who did it even though we weren't great shakes. Then we came back to New Zealand, and one of the shockers for us in New Zealand was suddenly the awareness, oh my goodness, the mission task is the same here. There are so many people who don't know Jesus, and they're very resistant to knowing Jesus. So the next period of my lives, well, I think what Jesus was teaching me was about mission in New Zealand. And I think I've mentioned the potluck. What is this one's in grey, because the stuff that's happening now, you don't know if that's what God's teaching you. You're kind of guessing. I think for me, I'm writing these. Okay, that's me. Oh, and by the way, where does it end? It ends in hope and home. Okay, what about you? Now, there are bits of paper and pens at the back if you'd like to, or if you're an extrovert, you might want to just turn to the person next to you and say, reflect, or even just sit in your own space. In the chapters of my life, what have been the shapers, and what has been the aspect of Jesus who I can see in that portion? Now remember, not everything just up to you is fun. I've missed off my mum dying, getting hit by cars. There's tough stuff, because I had 6 things. I'd like to invite you to be involved in a slightly interactive bit of a sermon now. Don't worry, you don't have to say anything. I'm going to play a song. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long. There are bits of paper at the back. I'd like you to be reflecting and thinking, okay, when I look at my life so far, what have been the really significant shapers for me? And to ask the question, I call them shapers because while we love to think of it in terms of language of what did you learn, actually sometimes things aren't learned. They change us. So I'd like you to take that 5 minutes, and then the back question is, what aspects of Jesus were big for you at that time? And what's happening now? Does that sound all right? Okay, 5 minutes. At the end of that, we'll do a wee recap. And as I mentioned, there's pieces of paper at the back. You can go back to this. I would encourage you to, in some time with God, reflect on this. Why? Because how we are made is very shaped by what God has written in our lives, good and bad. Why? Because I want us all to remember that in that journey, it ends with hope and home. Why? Because next week we're looking at our 100th. And actually there's value in knowing the stories that we are part of. I won't call our ones the littlest, because they're not little to us. But our stories fall in the context of bigger stories and bigger story and a glorious story. And they interconnect. So if you can notch down there's a bit of music here. This is a chance for you to reflect ask some questions about that. The songs are written. There's an artist couple who've finished doing all 150 psalms, setting them to music. So this is Psalm 1 to music. Reflective space. Be back in 4 or 5. So clearly there's not enough time to complete this, and no, it's not homework, you don't have to. But you know, we say things in our membership statement about following Jesus in the ways known and the ways yet to become known, and we live our lives that way. We know this much, we make decisions on an act, and there's things we don't yet know. That's how we live, and part of the gift of church is, as Jean said, to be encouraging one another. And part of that is to recognize this is what God was doing in this time period, and to be able to say to others, I remember this. And we're going to, next weekend, delight in being 100 years and look back and think, wow, wasn't it amazing that this happened and that happened? The strength and delight in knowing the God who heals, who gives spiritual gifts, those things are still true and alive now. But not everything stays stuck in time. We grow and change, and God works through it. So as we go to that, I kind of want to encourage us all to be deliberately appreciative. God, you gifted me with this in my life. This shaped me. But not to go, and it stops there. That was the right moment. But to know that that journey goes further as we have yet more rings to add to us. And the final ring that John of Patmos writes about is that of hope and being at home in a way that we so seldom are in this culture, in this life. Tim's going to lead us in a song. Thanks.